Hello, so we are going to discuss Anne Ranasinghe's July 1983. Now, she's a Sri Lankan poet, and her poem talks about a specific incident in Sri Lankan history. But the thing is that to understand the text of July 1983, we need to unpack some really complicated politics that sort of underlie this entire piece. So let's delve right into that. So now the primary setting of the poem, as I mentioned, is an incident of Sri Lankan history, which is called Black July. All right, and it's a really dark chapter in modern Sri Lankan history. But to understand how Black July really came to be, we need to go a little further into the past, and specifically into colonial past. Now, we are familiar with the concept of divide and rule, something that the British used as a colonial practice to sort of gain control of the space that they were. So it's actually a much older Roman technique called divide et impera, which is basically divide and rule. So there is enough evidence of this happening in the Indian subcontinent, even in Sri Lanka. Now in Sri Lanka, how much of this was premeditated is a whole different thing, but it did sort of unwittingly happen because so there are two communities that reside in Sri Lanka. You have the Sinhalese and you have the Tamils. Now, obviously the Tamil influence in Sri Lanka has to do with the long historical connection between Tamil Nadu as well as Sri Lanka over the many millennia that there has been an equation between them. So they have also sort of settled down and resided there and consider it their land. Now when the British came in, they brought with them missionary education, and obviously they brought English education as well. Now a lot of the Tamils took advantage of this education. Now as they gain more fluency and proficiency in English, they gain more access to government opportunities. All right. Now, obviously, at the surface, it looks like it's basically all the Tamils who are taking it over. But to be very honest, it was a small elite minority from the Sinhalese as well as the Tamil community that had access to these government opportunities. But this Tamil community is a really small community with context or with reference to the larger Sinhalese community. So this over-representation of Tamils in government positions did not go down too well. What this led to was this building of resentment between the two communities, and things really came to a head after the independence. So after independence, what happened is that a lot of the policies that were enacted by the new government, the Sri Lankan government, were aimed at discriminating against the Tamil community that lived there. And so as a result of it, this kind of resentment, this kind of violence, this kind of anger sort of led to a great deal of violent protests that started happening in Sri Lanka. In fact, things got so ugly that you had the formation of separatist Tamil movements, you had the rise of militant groups like the LTTE, that is the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. So you had a lot of these groups come in and things really got violent, alright, because one group would do something, the other group would retaliate, and so on and so forth. So you can imagine how terrible all of this really became. But things really got to a head. And one of the major incidents of this entire rioting process was the Jaffna burning, or the burning of the Jaffna Public Library. So this happened on 1st of June 1981, and this was orchestrated by a group of Sinhalese individuals, and they burned down this library because it was seen as a symbol of Tamil identity. Alright, because Jaffna as a region itself does have a large population of Tamils living there. All right, and many people from the community were instrumental in having this library come up in the first place. So it's very easy to sort of see it as a a symbol of Tamil identity. But the thing is that the library itself is a very important monument to Sri Lankan identity because it has a lot of historic documents, palm leaf manuscripts, newspaper records dating back to hundreds of years in the Jaffna Peninsula, and all of which records the history of Sri Lanka itself, not specifically of just any one community, but of Sri Lanka itself. So it is actually a symbol of Sri Lankan identity, but considering it was built or planned by the Tamil community, it was seen as a symbol of Tamil identity. And at the time of the burning, this particular library, the Jaffna Public Library, was actually one of the biggest in Asia, and it housed a collection of more than 97,000 books and manuscripts. And it was a really popular library because you had scholars from different parts of the world who would come in to access the library's resources. Nevertheless, it was burned down, and this is actually considered one of the most violent, ethnically motivated acts of biblioclasm of the 20th century. Biblioclasm or libricide is basically the burning of books, obviously, to make a statement. So this is one of those really significant incidents that we have, and ethnically motivated because it is against a specific community. Now, the Jaffna Public Library was still under reconstruction when Black July happened. Alright, and Black July, as the title of the poem itself tells you, was in July 1983. And it is an anti-Tamil pogrom that happened from the 24th of July 1983 till the 30th of July. That's a 7-day period. And it was originally acts of violence aimed at the Sri Lankan Tamils, but eventually, as with any act of violence that will get out of hand, it began to involve any Tamil people, including those from India who were residing at Sri Lanka at that point of time. Now, the trigger for the incident, because obviously for a riot to happen, we always say that, oh, this happened and that's why this happened, because it doesn't just come out of nowhere. That is the implication. So ostensibly the trigger for this incident was the ambush by the LTT on the Sri Lankan army patrol, which happened on 23rd of July, and that resulted in the death of 13 soldiers. But the thing is that it has been defined as a pogrom, as an anti-Tamil pogrom. And so if it is a pogrom, it is a premeditated act of ethnic cleansing. So to understand what a pogrom is, we'll have to sort of delve a little deeper. But actually, by the very fact that we are discussing a pogrom, helps us understand why Anne Ranasinghe writes her poem the way she does. Because her poem uses a lot of overtones of the Holocaust. And why would she do so in a text about a Sri Lankan experience has to do with the fact that the word pogrom itself has traditionally been associated with Jews. Now, a pogrom is defined as a violent riot, okay, and it's aimed at massacring or expelling an ethnic or religious group. And like I said, traditionally used to refer to the violence experienced by the Jewish community. This word, by the way, pogrom, is a Russian term. So it was used to refer to the acts of violence against Jews in Russia, in the Russian Empire. Alright. And obviously they were all aimed at sort of forcing the Jewish population out of the land. Now the thing is that this kind of widespread violence was not, of course, restricted to Russia because right across Europe, Jews have always experienced great deal of violence and prejudice and have been on the receiving end of assault and other heinous acts. And so, which is why this word pogrom actually got even co-opted into the English language. Originally, it referred to, of course, such acts of ethnic cleansing aimed at the Jewish population. But in modern parlance, the word has sort of broadened its meaning to include any such act of violence, ethnic violence, aimed at purging a population, all right, aimed at a minority group by a majority group, all right. Now, the thing is that you could just call it a mob violence, right? Why call it specifically a term like this? Because the thing is that pogrom is not merely an act of mob violence, it is an act of mob violence with the tacit approval of the government. And it is usually premeditated. There's a lot of planning that goes into a pogrom, which is what sets it apart from an ordinary riot. You can say, okay, this happened, and so there is a widespread, act of violence against a particular community, and that would be any other riot or mob violence. But for it to be a premeditated act with the approval of the government changes the entire narrative, because what ends up happening is that there are no witnesses to be found. No one can be convicted. We don't know who did it. We have no idea how it happened. Oh, it's terrible. Those are the kind of statements you can make with a pogrom. And that's what makes it so deeply disturbing, because you are looking at people intentionally wanting to wipe out a population. Now, Black July, which spans 7 days, is a pogrom targeting Sri Lankan Tamils. Now, like we said, the trigger incident is supposed to be the 23rd July ambush and murder of 13 soldiers. But on 24th, when the riots happened, ordinary citizens turned against Sri Lankan Tamils who lived around, their premises, all of those things. So like any other mob violence. But why this is a pogrom, why this is a premeditated act, is because the mobs had lists of people's names. Who among these were Sri Lankan Tamils? Which of these properties were owned by Sri Lankan Tamils? Are they living in a house rented? And in which case is the original owner Sri Lankan Tamil, or is the owner Sinhalese? They had access to all this information. This kind of information is traditionally, exclusively something that the government has access to. For an ordinary rioting citizen or a mob to have access to such information implies months of planning. It is not oh, we got angry, this happened, and so we decided to do this. In fact, considering the kind of violence that had been going on and off between the Sri Lankan Tamils and the Sinhalese, I'm sure they wouldn't have required to wait for anything specific, because there were always such incidents occurring. So I think what they deemed was the biggest incident became the trigger point for something like this, and thus the pogrom occurred. Now, there were a lot of properties destroyed, as mentioned, Sri Lankan Tamil properties, in places where you had Tamils living in Sinhalese homes. So they were renting it out. They were dragged out of the house with their goods, and then they were slaughtered on the street. So those houses were not burned because of Sinhalese houses. Those houses that were definitely owned by Tamils were burnt down. That's a lot of planning. But the thing is that why do we also call it a pogrom? We said that it has to have the tacit approval of the government. There were many around that point of time in Sri Lanka in different parts. There were a lot of foreigners who were also living there, and so there are eyewitness records of people from who obviously were not targeted because they were neither Tamil nor they were Sinhalese or Sri Lankans. They were, just there probably on holiday, and they talk about how in many places they noticed either the law enforcement officials were not participating, were just sort of standing by and letting all of this happen, and in some places they were actively participating. All right, and yet there are no witnesses, there are no records, there is no one to convict for any of these crimes. Now, like I mentioned in the beginning, of course, all of this was specifically targeted at Sri Lankan Tamils, but over time it became about anyone who was Tamil. And so when that happened, and there were Indian Tamils who were getting targeted, obviously the Indian government also got involved, which is where it truly became an international problem. And then, of course, the riot sort of got reined in, surprisingly, because up till that point of time they were like, oh, we're not able to stop it, we don't know how to stop it. And then eventually, because this was going to become an international problem, it did get reined in. But you see, the thing is that with any act of violence, definitely with the pogrom as well, we're not just talking about the immediate acts of violence that have happened. We're not just talking about the people who died, were murdered and slaughtered on streets, or the properties that were destroyed, so the economic losses that were endured, but we're also talking about the people who went into exile because of this, who as a result of this experience have never been able to return to Sri Lanka. Many people ended up displaced, many people ended up in refugee camps. A lot of people chose to just leave Sri Lanka because this was something that was so unprecedented. And of course, many of them joined militant groups after that. So it's not like the violence subsided, it just got worse. Right? And that's the danger of it. And while we are discussing that, we should also mention that the ones who did survive did not only do so because they were away from a space of violence. They did it because there were people who did assist them. Sinhalese people, non-Hindus who were living there, non-Tamils who were living there, who decided to step up and be good people and assist them. So there were those situations. It's not like every Sinhalese person was murdering a Tamil person out there, but there were many such acts of violence. So any act of violence results in a great deal of loss, and so it's not a simplistic incident at any point. So with this, we sort of have now an understanding of the background of Black July. So we will next step into the actual poem itself. Tune in.